Good afternoon, everyone. How is everybody? Thank you for attending during the end of the semester, but we have a great panel here today. We're being recorded, just so you know. So, best behavior. Mike, not joking. All right, so this started with Richard Delio up here. He's going to sort of moderate the panel. He's from the Entertainment Software Association. I'll let him tell you more about that somewhere whenever he wants to. But they kind of care about video games and represent for video games up in Washington, D.C. Well, down in Washington, D.C.? Yeah, down. Also joining us for the panel, we have Kate Edwards, who's the Executive Director of IGDA, International Game Developers Association. So she pretty much knows everybody. That's my expectation. Then there's Mitch Gittleman. He's at Harebrained Schemes. Do you know everybody too? I'm not sure.
What's that? What's the question?
Do you know everybody?
I know everybody in the room, yes.
All right, there you go. So Mitch is here to help join the panel. We have Robert Shibley. He is from FIRE, which, what does that stand for? Foundation of Individual Rights in Education. So the idea is free expression, video games, censorship, hot topics right now. And I guess I should introduce Jesse Schell as well. Distinguished professor, CEO of Shell Games. Some of you might know him, recognize him from this room. Couple of things that we did. We gave this group a tour. One of the things we were telling them is how our students are the best part. So two of the teams already have helped represent in that regards, and I think they're going to have a great discussion. And then they hope they'll go to Q&A. And then as I'm sure this is like maybe 50% of the reason why you're here, pizza afterwards, where they'd be happy to discuss with you all on topics broad and wide around having careers in this industry. So I will turn it over to Richard and give Kate my mic.
Thank you. So just some background why we wanted to do this. Censorship, video games, culture, all that stuff comes together in places like this, and I'm sure people have noticed in the news lately the concept of freedom of expression on college campuses. So, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with video games, but it's all connected because, we think that, as artists or as creators or developers, producers, whatever role you play in the process of making creative stuff, you should be able to express yourself. So that's why we put this panel together. I think I'm just going to jump right in, and I'm going to start with Robert. So why should we care about freedom of expression in video games? What is all this? Who cares? Tell me why we should care.
I think the elemental reason we should care is because it's art. You folks are engaged in an artistic endeavor here, and I think that was really made. I visited a couple of the projects today, and you guys are dealing with the same kind of media that any other kind of artist deals with. Film or graphic art or sculpture. I went to one, I can't remember the name of it right now. The first one I saw was dealing with how game mechanics affect your emotions, how the actual mechanics can affect your emotions, right? That's what artists do. They affect your emotion. That's what makes art more powerful than simply writing out how you feel or writing out your opinion. It's what makes poetry instead of prose, right? And so I think it was really neat that I got that tour when we came, because it really brought home to me an interesting way how there's sort of both a scientific and artistic endeavor that it goes inside what you guys do. And when you have that, if you want to advance the frontiers of something, you have to be free to explore wherever that takes you. People can be very uncomfortable sometimes. I mean, if you're playing with something like emotions, and I think you have to in order to design any kind of art, video games included, that's a powerful thing to be doing to people, to be on purpose, sort of manipulating the way they feel. But that's sort of a privilege that our society has given to artists, and we'd be poor without it. And so, especially at in a university setting like this, I think it's very important that video game developing programs and just entertainment technology generally be something that is seen where seen in a way that it is on par with other art. And look, you know, I understand that, you know, if you're going to my mom, for instance, she thinks video games are, you know, weird. She thinks computers are the devil. She said that several times. I hope she doesn't see this video, but she probably won't because she doesn't have a computer. You know, she thinks that's very. She sort of degraded that, but I think it's become clear to most people, and particularly to our generation, how much a part of the sort of culture video games have become. And I think video games need to play under the same rules of other cultures. Sometimes they're going to be boundary pushing. Sometimes there's going to be mistakes that are made, and we need to have a space for people to make those mistakes. And there's no place that's more appropriate for that than the college campus, where you guys are here learning. You know, you're not subject to the commercial, prerogatives that you will eventually be subject to. But it's important to be able to experiment now more than ever.
Very good answer. Thank you. So, Jesse, then go to you. What role then do you have as a professor, a dean, an administrator, in an atmosphere like this to make sure that students can express themselves through content or even mechanics maybe that some people might find offensive or troublesome? Like, how far do you think you have to go to protect someone's, you know, freedom to express themselves in a college environment?
Well, I think it all depends on the college environment. I mean, one of the things I think we're sort of blessed with here at Carnegie Mellon is that there is is sort of taken for granted that students are kind of free to express themselves and that they should be pushing these boundaries the best they can. So, but I do think, I guess from my point of view, it is the prerogative of the faculty to, when they see students wavering because they are uncertain whether they should be truthful and bold or whether they should sort of hide the way they feel in the name of just sort of worry that some hammer will come down. I think it's the faculty's prerogative to encourage them towards, you know, expressing how they really feel.
So the issue then is not necessarily censorship from above, but self-censorship, right? Teach people not to censor themselves.
Presently, in the realm of video game development in colleges, at this current time, censorship from the administration isn't really an issue because it's not taken seriously as an expressive medium at all. And frankly, it is a rare case when students actually use the medium to push the boundaries in a meaningful artistic way. I will say that we have hundreds of different colleges that are now having video game programs, and most of the students are content to just imitate what they've already seen in the marketplace, and it is rare that they're pushing the boundaries. But it is starting to happen, and as it starts to happen more and more, I think it is easy to imagine a day coming when schools are going to start to put a clamp down on these things for various reasons.
And also, anybody feel free to jump in at any time. I'm going to go through some points here. So what you said, I think, dovetails very interestingly into the question I have for Mitch then, which is, you know, if you have an example, or if you can just describe the process. So if you're sitting down as a developer or, you know, a project manager, producer, and you know that probably something in your game is going to upset somebody, which seems inevitable nowadays, what's the conversation like? Or, you know, maybe more specifically, is it helpful at the end of the day to just have somebody to say, this is what's going to go in the game, and this is what isn't, and that's that? I imagine that sort of team demographic or probably doesn't work too well. So you have to have some kind of consensus.
No, we don't really think about it as consensus for this particular topic. There's a game director, a creative director for each of our individual games, but we're a very, very collaborative group, and so we play each other's content and give feedback on each other's content. So there is no formal process for something like that. It's more about the collaborative nature of creating interactive content. So in a specific instance, I remember we make a game called Shadowrun, and it's important it's important to note what it is, because like Gene Roddenberry with Star Trek, who was able to explore these very human issues sort of in outer space in the help me geeks, thank you, 23rd century.
Kate with a save.
Shadowrun is a blend of like Blade Runner, cyberpunk future, and The Lord of the Rings. And what if those were mashed up in the 2050s? And that's this amazing intersection between technology and this sort of, not only just sort of magic out of spell books and stuff, but also Aboriginal cultures regaining their personal power, right? So it's a great tapestry, a great landscape to explore the human condition. So in our most recent game, as we travel around the world in this particular game setting, we can explore how different cultures change over time and evolve over time with the real technology we're dealing with, and then the sort of other fantastical element. And when we explore that, we find very interesting topics, and we're able to play with them. So for example, in our most recent game, which took place in Hong Kong, one of the major characters in the game, there is a real question among the audience: is this character male or female? And we don't have an answer, nor are we interested in the answer. The answer is, who is this character? And there was at no point a discussion about that character, whether that character should go in the game, what's appropriate. It was only, is there truth here?
So to dig into that a little bit, you mentioned one of the aspects of the game world. Because I played both of them now. I haven't gotten to Hong Kong yet. I'm getting there.
Shame on you.
Don't be mad. I have a backlog that's like a year long of games. One of the things that makes an appearance is a sort of a resurgence of Native American, magical traditions and spiritualism. So, but Shadowrun has been around a long time. So I wonder, is there any sort of sensitivity around doing something like that now that maybe didn't exist in the 1980s? Or it's just part of the setting now and we just proceed as planned?
No, there is a real sensitivity, and especially, my studio is situated in the location where Shadowrun takes place in Seattle. I'm from Seattle, Washington, and one of the most important native tribes is the Salish tribe, and who have a real presence. So we decided to reach out to them before making the game, to someone from the Salish Council on Culture, to try and figure out, what do we need to know to represent them properly? What sort of topics should we stay away from, etc. And it goes right back to that previous statement I said before about gender, which is truth. As long as there's truth, everything's fine.
So Kate, your company, and I wanted you to tell us a little bit about it, but I'm curious if these are the kinds of things that you have to concern yourself with when you're doing localization. Like if you're going to make a game suitable for another region, do you have these concerns in mind? And then on top of that, at what point does somebody have to sort of compromise their creative vision in order to sell a game somewhere else? And there's good examples of that. Maybe we can get into them.
Yeah, so just to clarify, what I do is culturalization, which is different from localization. So localization within the industry is mostly seen as translation, which for the most part, that's what it entails. Whereas I'm actually a geographer who's been in the industry for over 20 years. About half of that was at Microsoft, where I created an internal team called geopolitical strategy. So basically my job was to protect the company against political and cultural risk in all of their content. So it involved anything involving like the use of maps, the use of flags, gestures, color usage, because it's culturally specific, and on the list goes. And so when the game studio got started, I was focusing on all the games that Microsoft was producing. So if you want to take just something like Age of Empires, for example, that was a very challenging series of games to work on because they were representing real history as well, real, quote, real history, kind of generalized to a degree, but they were trying to be true to the historical scenarios in the battles. So like one, for example, in the first Age of Empires, involved where the Choson Empire was overrun by the Yamatos from Japan. which that's what history tells us happened. The Japanese basically invaded the Korean peninsula and mostly took it over. And so when the game was released in Korea, the Korean Ministry of Information said that never happened. Never happened that way. And so they banned the game, and they said we need to basically change history in order to appease the Korean government. And there was a huge ethical debate, as you can imagine, internally about should we do this? Is this the right thing to do? And of course, at the time, which was 1997, this is just on the eve of StarCraft, and we all know how important RTS games are to Korea these days. And so Age of Empires being an RTS, we made a business decision that it was a very important genre to get into Korea. And so we went ahead and made a patch only for Korean players where effectively the Chosun Empire invaded Japan instead of the other way around. Now, one of the things I had to remind people of is that when I worked on Encarta Encyclopedia, the French and Italian versions of the encyclopedias had different heights for Mont Blanc because the two governments did not agree on the exact height of the mountain. So, is this historical fact, in quotes, that much different from the physical fact of the height of the mountain? And that's where it's not just a localization change. It's not just about translation. It's about meeting local expectations. And so when I work with game developers, I'm usually working with them, unlike localization, which tends to happen at the end of a product cycle because you have to wait for the content to be produced. With culturalization, I sit down on day one with the writers, the artists, the producers. We talk through the assumptions that they're making in the game. Who are the characters? What is this world like? Is there a political system? Is there a faith system? What is it based on? Even if it's a complete fantasy world, I still want to know because as artists and creators, people tend to draw upon what they know, which is our world here, and they'll draw their inspiration from different religions or different cultures. It's like every single desert-related culture I've seen in any video game has some kind of visual relationship to the Arab culture and Bedouins. And that's just the way it is. And you see it in movies too, you see it in Star Wars, you see it in all kinds of other stuff too. It's just the way it is. And it's one of those very key, cultural things with that folk culture and the way that their clothing was, that it evokes, this is a desert culture. And so, I will work with them to work through the assumptions that they're making and try and help them understand, I'm taking a very surgical approach. I really respect the creative vision and I do not want to mess with it. I don't want to trample on it. But at the same time, my mission, what I try and do is make sure that their creative vision can be enjoyed by as many countries around the world as possible, by as many cultures. And so sometimes that requires a slight little surgical tweaking, like they created a symbol for a certain clan that's not going to work in a certain culture or two, or something like that. And so I just try and tweak it for them and help them, show them the way.
Yeah, it bears pointing out it's not always bad. For example, Robert and I were talking about this today. Fallout 3, back when it shipped, the drug that's in the game called Med-X was originally called morphine. But Australia, I think it was Australia, had a problem with morphine being in the game. So you could kind of get up in arms, I guess, about, hey, don't make us change the creative vision. Whereas they took Bethesda, I believe, took a very sort of rational approach. And they were like, listen, and Pete Hines said this, all the drugs in our game have fictional names anyway, except for this one. So if we change this to Med-X and it sounds like Buff Out and Psycho and all the other drugs in the game, it really shouldn't be a big deal. And it was actually probably the nicest way something like that could possibly end, right? So they were able to get what they want. They were able to sell the game in Australia, and they didn't have to compromise their creative vision.
Exactly. Whereas conversely, in the same game, one of the things that actually happened in Fallout 3 that made the game unsellable in India was the fact they had a two-headed Brahmin bull wandering the landscape. And because the Brahmin is a sacred animal to the Hindu faith, and there are laws in India that actually protect real Brahmin bulls from being harmed, so the legal teams in India were very skittish about having this game released there because of this. And that was one of the issues that Bethesda was not willing to fix because of all kinds of technical reasons. They didn't want to go back and retest and all these other things. But it's unfortunate because that one content element made the game not sellable in India. And that's just too bad. It's a lost opportunity.
So let's tie all that together, and I have a few questions on a bunch of these topics, so we might not get to all of them. So it seems to me, and if you study media, this becomes apparent, like if there's any communications folks in here, you notice that the American attitudes towards violence and gun violence tend to be different than, say, the European attitudes. So we seem to be okay with, pretty outstanding levels of gun violence and fantasy violence, whereas sex is pretty much off limits. And in many countries in Europe, it's the exact reverse. So if a country is going to say, well, we're okay that in Fallout you can literally explode a guy's head, that's okay, but we don't like the word morphine, right? You have to say, you have to question, where they're coming from. So from a business perspective, and anybody can chime in on this, how do you teach developers or programmers or artists or whoever to navigate this, whether it's once they get to the world of work, whether it's when they're in school? How do you teach them to do it? And anybody can answer.
We talk about it a bit. It comes up a bit here at the Entertainment Technology Center. I mean, I guess fundamentally, it's important to understand that art and entertainment are not the same thing, right? Entertainment is show business, and business is business, right? I mean, so for example, your Age of Empires example is an excellent example. We have a company that decided, yes, we're going to go along with false Korean propaganda so that we can make a buck off the Korean people. That was a business decision that they made, whether good or bad, that's like somebody's choice to make. If you're an artist, it's a very different kind of set of circumstances. So I think the important thing with all these is to engage with it thoughtfully and to decide, what are we doing, why are we doing it, how does it fit with our goals? Because there's always a landscape of restrictions, no matter what. Part of what we do at the school is we make them live within these restrictions. Like in my Building Virtual Worlds class, we explicitly say, you cannot build worlds that are pornographic, and you cannot build worlds that have shooting violence in them. Now, it's not the shooting violence in particular is not for any moralistic reason, but because we find that shooting violence worlds tend not to be very creative. And so by placing that constraint in there, they find creative solutions to get to something new. And usually the right solution in the real world is when you run up against these kind of constraints, well, you can whine about it, or you can use it as an opportunity to do something more creative. So we try and create opportunities where they can deal with it.
And I just want to follow up on that really quick. I mean, that's one of the points about making sure you're focused on your goals and your creative goals is super important, because I know whenever I give a lecture about culturalization, I usually end it on the point of emphasizing the difference between art and commerce, between art and business. So if you're in this just for art, then I don't care what you make. I really don't. I mean, be political, be offensive, I don't care. It's an art form. You can do whatever you want. But if you're in it to make any kind of money off this, then you're suddenly subject to the rules of commerce and business, and there's all these other considerations that you have to think about. And I think a lot of developers, they get those muddled a little bit.
There was a great example that just happened recently. Ai Weiwei, the famous Chinese artist, he's famous for creating sort of controversial pieces. He had a vision of creating a wall out of Legos, right? He wanted to create this massive wall out of Legos to kind of make a certain artistic point. So, he calls up Lego Central and says, hey, I want to make a bulk purchase of thousands and thousands of Legos, way more than I can buy on Amazon. And Lego said, no way, right? Because we have a rule here at Lego that Legos will not be sold to make political statements of any kind. And so here we have art and commerce like bang, right up against each other. And this sort of thing happens all the time.
I think in our case, going back to that whole truthy thing, we try and create an environment where, first of all, it's all about respect for your audience, respect for your teammates. And then there's that integrity portion of it, and people who actually have moral values and personal sense of integrity. Well, that leads to conflict. Integrity is what leads to conflict. And so we try and take the business out of that by putting it more at a business level and allowing the teams to do what it is they need to do, thinking in terms of business, of course, but when it comes to skirting that edge, it's all a matter for them of what is appropriate. And then if someone like me has to step in and say something from a commerce point of view, they understand it's from a commerce point of view, and that we're dealing with those teams in a very, respectful manner. And they understand, we need to keep our jobs, and we need a place to create. And so they're willing to allow my partners and I to make hard decisions, if we were ever to come up on those, in order to keep the lights on. That's just the reality of the situation.
Yeah, I think there's always going to be that tension between the two. I think with the Age of Empires example, though, and not to pick on Microsoft too much, but when particularly as video games go from straight entertainment efforts to one of the educational efforts I heard about here today, I think the ethical quandary gets a lot worse, and maybe the Mont Blanc example is one that's close, but you run into this potential for actually getting governments or pressure groups or whatever to say, well, you know what, the message of we want your game, but the message needs to be different. We want your educational game. We want, there's probably a number of Koreans who have a misapprehension about what actually happened in history now, thanks to that decision. And those decisions sort of accrete; they add up over time. And so I think there's I think that's an ethical concern people are really going to start struggling with more as video games and interactive entertainment generally becomes more. I mean, if you were to make if you were to try to make what's the movie, the D-Day invasion movie, Saving Private Ryan, where the Axis is invading, the Allies. So you can sell it in Germany or whatever. I mean, there's some we sort of laugh or chuckle at that, but there's some element to that, to doing all that, and that's why I think it's so important to remember that. I think it's interesting the solution that you said, Mitch, is like let the art part happen, and then if there needs to be corrections for commercial reasons later, I think where it would really worry me is where we start. If you were to start getting in the pattern of telling developers or artists or whatever, like, it needs to be, you need to create a game that does X because politically speaking, that's what has to be done, as opposed to kind of letting them do their vision and then going back. So maybe that's a way to square the circle. I don't know.
Actually, if I may, I just realized we're in the middle of something fascinating at our studio, because what we're doing is we are reviving 30-year-old properties. Right, Shadowrun is one. Another one is called BattleTech, giant robots. It's sort of like Game of Thrones in space.
Yeah, I've never heard of it. I don't know what you're talking about.
You're a backer, and thank you for that. But because these are 30-year-old properties, they were created by a different generation of game developers who are not as culturally sensitive as we are today. Even though I was one of them, I'm now more culturally sensitive because growth and age and stuff and time. And so we're going back to these old properties now that have some cultural challenges in them. And the balancing act is actually bringing them up to 2015, 2016, when they were created in the 80s. And you would just take, oh, well, it's the ancient samurai. Of course, we revere the ancient samurai. It's like, well, that's great. But there's more to Japanese culture than Bushido. Right? And how do we bring that to our audience and bring that up to sort of modern standards without offending people that have been following this intellectual property for 30 years?
Right, because people want their samurai in their game.
Absolutely, they do. And so the question is, how do we thread that needle? How do we bring something like that up to speed, so to speak, without alienating an older audience? It's a very different animal, but I just realized, oh, wow, yeah, that's happening.
And something that you mentioned, Robert, that I had not thought of until you just said it. We were talking earlier, and Jesse was as well. Education games in education are becoming a thing, slowly but surely. And, if you look at some states are directly involved in the curriculum that goes in their textbooks. It is very easy to envision a situation where a state says, if you want to teach the Civil War, I imagine, depending on what state you're in, there's going to be different Civil War narratives, and it's probably not for the best that happens.
Yeah, there are states where you're not allowed to call it the Civil War.
It's the War of Northern Aggression.
Right. Right, either the war between the states or the war of northern aggression. It's not meant to, right, because the notion that Civil War implies certain things.
Well, we already saw a little of that, right? With after the shooting in South Carolina, that Apple took down what was a real General Gettysburg because it had a representation of the Confederate battle flag in the game to represent the Confederate battle lines. And that was taken down for several days. It was later put back up, but it was sort of an interesting way that politics really like reached into the gaming world real quick. And a lot of people were very concerned and said, well, that's I mean, you're actually depicting Confederate people battling. I don't know what other symbol you would use. How much do we want to clean that up? I mean, certainly you can't look at Castle Wolfenstein without seeing a lot of swastikas. But of course in Germany, they can't give a swastika there, right? I mean,
they're loosening up a little bit under very strict historical context, and that's what I was going to mention. Is this is speaking to the issue of cultural context that is extremely important when we're talking about creating games, because to give you another example, and it's a Korean example, and another Age of Empires one. So in Age of Empires 2, when Age of Empires 2 came out in 1999, the artwork on the box, back when we had boxes, the box art was very unwelcome in Korea. In fact, Korean retailers didn't want to put it on the shelf, and it's because it had a picture of a Japanese samurai on the box. And now a lot of people kind of knee-jerked and said, well, it's that age-old Japanese-Korean thing. Yes and no. The real answer is in 1999, to give you a little geopolitical background, the two countries are going at each other over the disputed islands of Dokdo in Korean, or Takashima in Japanese, in the middle of the sea, Japan, called East Sea in Korean. Basically, they go back and forth over, they have little periods of anxiety and foot stomping over it. And in 1999 was one of those periods of high tension between them. And so Korean retailers did not want to put anything Japanese on the shelf because of it. And Age of Empires just happened to be kind of caught in the crosshairs because of it. This stuff still happens. Just 2 or 3 years ago in China during the month of December 2012, Japanese goods saw over 50% drop in China, like Honda, Sony, Toyota, and it's because because China and Japan are going at each other over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands off of Taiwan. And so these real-world geopolitical things kind of infringe on the creative context in which you're entering. I mean, when Resident Evil 5 was about to come out, they released a bunch of images from the game that caused outrage here in the United States. Because why? You saw this clean-cut Caucasian dude going around gunning down sub-Saharan African villagers. And that's very stark imagery. And I know a lot of commentaries were written about it. A lot of people were upset, saying, this is crazy. Why would you put this kind of imagery in such a game? Now, a lot of the things, I think some of the criticism was valid, but at the same time, what's the cultural context in which the game was created? Most of that game was developed in Japan. It's 98% ethnic Japanese. The notion of diversity is just not the same as it is in North America or Europe.
And to push back a little bit against some of that criticism, a lot of it I found was unfounded. I mean, the whole premise of Resident Evil is you're going around shooting zombies. So if it's okay to shoot zombies in Raccoon City, it should be okay to shoot zombies in any city in Africa or anywhere in the world for that matter. So
that's zombie racism, and I won't have it here.
It's problematic, as they say. But at some point, a game developer or a studio has to sort of put their foot down and say, okay, we hear your criticism, but maybe you're taking this out of context, and it's not really about a Caucasian going to Africa to shoot people. It's a zombie game, and it happens to be in Africa. I mean, what's the alternative? You make all the zombies in Africa white?
Well,
that's probably not going to work.
Go to Africa.
The alternative. Or you can just say, what would the dynamic be different if the shooter was an African American shooting sub-Saharan African villagers? That does change the dynamic to some degree. I know, speaking with friends, African American friends, they said yes, that would have made a difference to them because it changes the whole dynamic. Because when you have the white protagonist gunning down the African villagers, you're kind of bringing into this historical notion of the great white hunter and the dark continent and all these things from the Victorian era that kind of resonate really negatively still.
It's part of what made Night of the Living Dead so powerful, right?
Exactly.
It was an African American protagonist going up against a bunch of white zombies, and it was part of why that movie has stayed with us, I think.
Yeah.
So we just touched on a lot of different points here. One of the really interesting things that was brought up was how you teach students to navigate, this can be very complicated world of business and intersecting interests. So let's say, and this may be an unfair question, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but let's say, Wolfenstein, the original Wolfenstein, which is full to the brim with, Nazi iconography, if that had been made on a campus now, do you think it would be made? Do you think it would see the light of day? Would it be in the student's portfolio? Would it be able to be shown at the end of the year as a project? And if not, why not?
I don't know. Like in an American school, so Americans don't have any problem with gun violence. Like, Americans seem to like gun violence. Mass shootings don't seem to trouble us very much. So a game about mass shooting a bunch of Nazis, I think it was fine back then. I don't think it would trouble anybody now. Maybe I have that wrong, but I'd be surprised if it raised an eyebrow.
I think it's not about Nazis now. I don't think that's the right group. So now the question is, do we replace it with the ISIS flag? Or, and for Americans, it's just like, no, go ahead, right, no problem. Then the question is, well, what if it's a zombie game that takes place on a school, in a school campus?
That you'd have trouble with.
Right now, I'm going to go around and I have zombie 6th graders, and I'm going to go shooting up a school. Okay, now we can talk. Now that's a topic.
Right. Yeah, because people would have a problem with a game that kind of confronted that issue, not so much with actually stopping the issue, but would certainly it would be a thing that would make people more comfortable.
Well, part of this too is, speaking to an issue that I think is important to clarify is that when I'm making a lot of these decisions, you have to think about the intended audience and the unintended audience. And so with the intended audience, who are game players, who understand contextual issues in game content. So like with the Resident Evil example, most people who play Resident Evil series, they know exactly what it's all about. They don't really care where it is. They don't care who's shooting. They know they have to kill zombies, so what? For the most part, they're not going to care. It's the unintended audience who are the ones who are typically going to do the knee-jerk because they don't play games or they don't understand the contextual issues. So all they're going to do, like exactly what happened, they're going to see the screenshot and react to it and say, oh my God, we can't have that. And some of their concerns are valid. I'm not saying it's not a valid concern to see a white dude gunning down poor African villagers, but at the same time, there is a loss of context there, and the different audiences is important.
How would we feel about that? I wonder if the game was meant to be a social commentary on that, though. A white person going and gunning down African villagers, or going through inner city, or whatever it might be. There's a place for that too. I think to bring up the Grand Theft Auto, which has turned people's stomachs for a long time. Various people, I think there is an element of social commentary to that game, and it may not be an appealing one, or maybe it is. I don't really know, and it's sort of part of the commentary. I think is that you get to make the choices, but certainly the presentation of that game can be vastly different depending on who's playing it and how you want to portray it. Should we be able to have a Grand Theft Auto? Would that be something that would be, that was born years and years ago, that franchise. Would there be a new one today?
Well, part of the Grand Theft Auto, yeah. For those watching online, of course, the idea is, I can pick up a hooker, right? I'll take that part of it, which everybody knows, right? And then, I can do my business, but then run over the hooker later and get my money back. And part of that is about being a contrarian and being, I'm a bad guy, and I'm going to do that, and that's part of the fun of the game. And when we're talking about this idea of making a social statement, there was no social statement in there. No, I don't think there's a social statement at all. I think the idea was just fun for somebody, and they felt irreverent when they did it. I don't feel there's any social statement at all. Now, the other element of that is, well, what if we made a game that was a social statement? Okay, that's probably interesting and might even do business if it was the right social statement. The question then comes down to, what if it's a social statement that's contrary to the norm? So we have not yet seen a game featuring a Ku Klux Klansman as the hero. but you can see there's a very strong social statement to be made there, and there may even be money to be made there. I don't want to funnel mine to it, but when you talk about social statements, a lot of people, when they think about it, yeah, make a social statement as long as it agrees with me.
Yeah, nobody ever wants to make the bad social statements.
Yeah, the BioShock games are a great example. I mean, all three of those are very distinct social statements against various ideologies, and they just happen to pick three that are particularly popular. You're right about that, but I think a game is probably there to be made for something that does skewer something that's popular, some sort of shibboleth that we hold dear as Americans, or I guess maybe it's different. Maybe abroad that's happening to them all the time, since America dominates so much of the entertainment industry. Maybe effectively they're already getting those games when we play Command and Conquer Generals, or whatever it might be, when the Allies come sailing in to bomb the heck out of the bad guys. So maybe that's a cultural part that we're not comfortable with either. But I think there has to be room for that to continue to exist, and I'm a little worried about particularly seeing what else is going on campus. I think I want us to be extra vigilant here on campus about we need to be able to have room to explore. I would like there to be a new Wolfenstein if somebody wants to make it. I don't want to get to the point where you can't do that because it's become difficult for some people to process the subject matter you're using.
So, Kate, talking about Resident Evil, you said something that was really interesting, and it was not a point that I had ever seen raised until you just said it, which is, okay, so you have a white guy in Africa shooting black zombies. Well, obviously they can't make all the villagers white, but you could make the protagonist black. Why did that not occur, perhaps, to the developers? Or to ask maybe a broader question, we're dealing with sort of a very Amerocentric conception of, everything gets wrapped up in identity politics, how you feel about, the state of the world and race relations and all that stuff. So is it wrong for us to expect a company in Japan to have that sensibility? Or if they're going to play on the global stage, do they need to have it?
I would say ideally they should have it. The thing is they weren't working in a vacuum. The team in Japan was working with the offices in the U.S. who are very much aware of these issues. So it's I would say there's a certain level of responsibility that falls on the markets where it is sensitive to raise the issue and say, hey, you may want to think about what you're doing here. But the fact that I don't think it necessarily hit the radar, it eventually did before the game came out, obviously, but the fact that it didn't initially hit the radar, that's one of the things that often happens in the development process is that, there's a lot of other issues that goes into it, to the creative process. Part of it in the game industry is we are all heads down, producing the game, cranking out content to a very hard deadline. Everyone is crunching. I'm not going to go into the whole work-life balance problems in the industry, but that culture, though, creates an environment in which it's really hard to stop and ask questions. One of the things I often advise teams to do, even small indie teams, somebody on the team at some point needs to look at that character design and ask why. Why do they look like that? Why is their skin color white? Why are they male or female? Sometimes, to Mitch's comment, it doesn't matter, so don't ask the question. If it has zero relevance to the character's placement in the game, but a lot of times it does. And so, look at the backlash that Star Wars Episode 7 is having over the main characters, a African-American male and a Caucasian female being the two principal characters in the movie. And we're seeing some level of backlash from certain people that, that's not cool. What happened to the white male protagonist? It's they're irrelevant. Does it have to be a white male? You got Han Solo. What else do you want? Come on.
Actually, what else do you want?
Exactly. So it's just interesting. I think a lot of times we see stereotypes pulled into games because they're familiar to the creators, so they know what to do with them, and that's a strong dynamic that happens in the creative process. And the other part is this not knowing exactly what to do. It's I'm not female and black, so I don't know what to do with this character, so I'm afraid to put them in the game.
And just real quick, and it's important to note that at no point I don't think was anybody suggesting Resident Evil 5 be censored, right? That was never part of the conversation that anybody was having. So we've sort of gotten past that culturally, where we're where we had gotten past it. The worry is now, is it coming back? Are we actually sort of demanding for things that we don't like to be taken off store shelves or, gotten rid of?
There was an example, and it was a few years back, but I don't know if people remember the Toy Story Sega Genesis game, right? So Toy Story is a big hit. Disney makes the Sega Genesis game, and that's not an easy game to translate into an easy movie to translate into gameplay. So they had to make up a bunch of stuff, and it doesn't really have villains, so they had to make up some villains. And somewhat thoughtlessly, they added a Mexican bandito toy as one of the bad guys. And they just didn't really think about it. A bunch of white guys making this thing, putting in this Mexican bandito character, and there was an outcry. And particularly given this is, Disney's in Southern California, which has a significant Mexican community. The outcry was significant, and eventually Disney recalled the cartridges, produced new ones that didn't have the Mexican bandito level. It cost them millions of dollars for this one thoughtless video game character.
And that's exactly the kind of thing I try and help the developers avoid, because that's why I work with them early, because it gets really expensive to fix this stuff. It's like when I worked on Viva Pinata at Microsoft, I don't know if you've played the game, but there's these little humanoid like caretaker characters that are part of the whole environment in the garden. And the initial design of the characters had dark brown skin and black hair, kind of the stereotype of the Mexican gardener. And I've raised a concern about that, because it's like, especially being from Southern California, in my cultural context, that's a huge problem. I mean, yes, it's there, but at the same time, it's very much a stereotype, so they didn't fix it.
I remember very vividly now, we were making a game 4 years ago, and we had this whole story. It's a very story-based game. It takes place in this Shadowrun universe, and one of our game designers pulled me and one of our creative directors in a room, and he said, the story of this game is sexist, right? And it just across the board, and I, kind of a white male, and I grew up with women as trophies in games, right? That's what you won. In Rocket Ranger, that's what you won in the game. It's an example. You won this girl, and you got your choice of them. So we go on, so he pulls us into a room, and this is a junior designer. This is one of the reasons why I'm so in love with this particular story. He just said, we can't do this. We cannot ship a game like this. You have to look at this story again through that lens. And I said, let's go through chapter and verse, name it. And he was able to go point, 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 and there were too many. I mean, one's too many, but there were about 7, right? And we were crunching, and it was just that sort of experience where it's like we should not, from a production point of view, change this, and we changed every single one of them because it was this, for me personally, it was a massive learning experience, and I didn't realize it till this moment, but it was one of the single most important learning experiences in my career, to be able to have somebody hold up a mirror like that, and for us to go, we're fixing it right now, and we're going to work nights and weekends to get it.
So we've talked a lot about, sort of American companies maybe having to make concessions or make changes. So that got me thinking about Metal Gear Solid 2. And right when that came out, 9/11 happened. And so I recall one of the final cutscenes of the game was this ship flying through New York City with the Twin Towers. And I can't recall, I should know this, but I don't. I can't recall if the ship crashed into the Twin Towers or if they were just in the background. But I remember, and if you have an old copy of the game, you can see this. It is a very abrupt, sort of messy cut that they had to do at the last minute. And they did it to sort of appease or appeal to American sensibilities, because they probably rightly figured that we would be upset having to watch that. Is that a triumph of sensitivity, or is that an overreaction? Anybody can answer that.
Yeah, what does that do to the game when you're in crunch time and you have to make those cuts? You've had all that time to do the game you thought you were doing, and then you've got to change 7 important points or make that ugly cut. What does that do to the vision of the game? Is it the same quality game? Or is there a trade-off there? Is it an appropriate trade-off?
Well, there was, I was at Microsoft at the time, and we were finishing up the next version of Flight Sim and also Project Gotham Racing when 9/11 happened. And of course, Project Gotham had the Twin Towers in it. And a lot of it, there was a huge amount of discussion and debate and very thoughtful conversation around this issue. Like, do we honor it? Do we take them out? And it really came down strictly to mainly production reality. It's like, what can we do at this stage in the process? Because it's September, and of course these are all holiday releases, so your time is very limited. And I believe, if I remember right, of course Flight Sim, we took them out because it's Flight Sim. You don't want to have people,
That was a smart move.
Yeah. With Project Gotham, I believe the decision was to leave them in, but then a note was added, kind of a memorial note, saying, in honor of those who lost their lives, but the reality behind that note is that we just did not have time to take them out.
That's wild. Kate and I were at Microsoft at the same time, working on Xbox at the same time, and also working on exactly the same portfolio for Holiday. I was working on a game called Mech Assault, and in Mech Assault, one of the primary gameplay elements was bringing down tall buildings with a giant robot. And those buildings looked like the Twin Towers. And there we are, what do we do? And I remember talking to Ed Freeze, who was the vice president of Xbox at the time, and I don't know if I said the right thing, but I'm going to tell you what I said. Please put this in historical context. I said, if we remove this, if we change the art, if we do anything, the terrorists win. And so we're not going to change a damn thing, and we're going to ship it. And that was the only conversation we had about that particular one.
We ran into the same thing, weirdly, making Toontown Online. So Toontown Online is a game where you have these happy cartoon characters who are beset by these evil business robots who are taking the merry world of Toontown and turning it into a bunch of office buildings. And so the big climax moment is after you've kind of infiltrated these office buildings and defeated a lot of these robots, that you run outside and you joyously watch this office building crush and explode into the ground. And we're like, wow, this, after 9/11, it's like, this doesn't have the same feeling of celebration that it used to. So we did change that moment, not so much because we were worried about sensitivity, but it was just more like, this doesn't feel right anymore. The context has changed in terms of what we're trying to do.
So we have about 5 minutes left. I just wanted to pose one more question to everybody on the panel. Again, you can answer if you like, or if you have an answer. Is there any game that you could think of that you've played that had content in it that was controversial or maybe even offensive, that you were glad that it was in there, that maybe it taught you something that you appreciated? Maybe the answer for all you guys is no, and we have 5 minutes to fill, but go ahead.
Wow, a game that pushes the boundaries. Definitely been some.
Well, if you look at the Dragon Age series, right, from BioWare, you can flirt with and eventually bed different characters, and they don't care what the gender of your character is, and neither does the NPC character. So you can play a gay character in there and have, sex with that character. Did I say that right?
You said it right, which is why everyone laughed, I think.
I guess. And yeah, I'm glad that's in there. I didn't do it. I don't want to flirt with characters in video games. That's not what I play video games for. I guess it's for the killing part, but
That sounds way healthier.
yeah. What? Yeah.
It's a very American attitude.
Dude, I'm playing Shadow of Mordor right now, and that's a killing game. So yeah, I'm glad that's in there. I'm glad my children are playing it, and I'm glad they're having the sex too. But
I'd argue that in the original BioShock, the controversy that was seems to have intentionally been created about the killing of the little sisters, right? You have this choice in the game where you can either murder these little girls or you can, or you can kind of, let them live. But the game mechanics intentionally are set up to make you kind of want to kill them, and it put this horrible tension that, and what I liked is it raised a discussion kind of just in the world in general about, well, what are these games about, and what is okay and what isn't okay, and that seems to have been quite intentional on the part of the designers. I was pleased to see that.
No, it's definitely intentional in those Shadowrun games. There are dark gray choices in there, and that's absolutely intentional. We want people to think like crazy and wonder about that kind of thing. And luckily we reward is the wrong word, but we reward both choices with real-world context for how that works out.
Well, I would say one game that comes to mind is, well, there was a couple. One was working on Jade Empire, because that was a really challenging project, because BioWare was wanting to make this pan-Asian world, which when I first encountered it, when they were first starting out, was like 80% Chinese with a dash of Japanese and Korean elements in it. And it was really going to be a disaster in terms of what they were doing, because they're basically saying, well, Pan-Asian basically means Chinese, but then we'll take the most iconic things from Japanese and Korean culture and throw them in there as if they're all the same thing. And so working through all that was a really challenging project. It was also really rewarding, working with a lot of advisors. We also created a language for the game, which was really, really cool. It was really fun to do, working with a linguist for months and months on that. The other project that never actually came out was one I was advising on just a couple of years ago, and it was a German game developer team. And the project's on hold. I don't think they're going to care if I mention, I'm not going to say exactly the name or anything, but basically they were wanting to make a game about a squad of Nazi soldiers at the very end of World War II who were basically retreating back to Germany after an unsuccessful invasion of Russia. And the way they wrote it was very emotional. It was really, the game itself was really interesting from that perspective, but it was also interesting working with that team and kind of getting their motivation for why they wanted to make this game, because they wanted to make this really strong anti-war statement, because they're seeing, Medal of Honor and Call of Duty and all this stuff. They're like, we're tired of war games, but we want to make a war game that is really anti-war. And we wanted to do it through that very distinct lens of being a Nazi soldier who's basically seeing your empire crumble. So I thought that was pretty fascinating.
I was going to use BioShock too, so you stole mine.
Sorry, buddy, too slow. So I think that wraps it up. We can, first of all, big round of applause for everybody on the panel. Thank you guys for being here. And I believe we can take some questions. I will walk around with the microphone.
My question is not to anyone specific, but Mitch mentioned a point about developers and ideas a few decades back being culturally insensitive. And I feel we have definitely become more sensitive now, but do you think that it's more like the current state of the atmosphere is people are easily offended? And does that mean that we, especially as students, should be more bold about our choices?
So that's an interesting question about people being more easily offended, because you cannot swing a dead cat on the internet without offending somebody for something, whether it's a Starbucks cup or whatever. And that's what social media is for, is about getting offended. But I think a more interesting question really is, I was talking to our community director last night about this exact topic, because a profound moment for me happened. I hired a Chinese-American game developer. I'm sorry, he was actually not Chinese-American. He was Chinese who transplanted himself to North America, and I hired him to make a game with me. And he said, one of my other games, which I don't really recall, it was from about 97, he said, that is the first game where I ever saw myself or somebody who looked like me in a game. And it changed my life, and it changed my career choice. And so I don't care about sensitivity at all. At all. What I care about, again, going back to, and this may sound highfalutin, is the truth. right? It's reflecting the world back to the world. And the idea, I'm not worried about sensitivity, I'm worried about that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, the only thing I would say that if that is what we feel, then why is there such a big discussion over, like, say, a white protagonist, like, killing black zombies? Shouldn't we be, like, not applauding, but, like, be appreciating that they were, like, bold enough to make that choice?
Well, from my perspective, I do think that people are far more sensitive today than they were 20 years ago. You know, I mean, thanks to all kinds of factors, social media being one of them, but not the only one. But to me, all it means is that you want to be more diligent, you know, when you're creating things. It doesn't mean you need to avoid sensitivity. It just means you need to be more cognizant of the fact of what you're actually creating and what the potential outcome can be. But that doesn't mean you change what you're doing. All it means is that you're aware of what the consequences might be. And it kind of goes back to the whole, you know, issue. It's like if you want to sell your game and you need to understand what factors might prevent it from being sold or might, you know, be a detriment to you.
Sorry, I just have to add on to that for a minute. When we talk about that sensitivity, why weren't people so sensitive back when I got into the game industry about 25 years ago? You didn't need to be sensitive. Your bosses were white men. Your customers were white men. What's the problem, right? But the truth is the business climate has changed, right? And our awareness has changed. So, of course, there's an evolution that's going to happen. Now, the problem is then there are people that are attempting to conserve what once was. And I understand that mentality, absolutely. When I was growing up, games were like this, and I yearned for games like that. But that's not the world today, and the world is evolving, and that's all there is to it. And as you can see from the business of games, we're being rewarded for that evolution.
I'll get to that side eventually.
This speaks directly to what you guys were just talking about. The laudable reaction to one of those moments where we go, oh crap, we released some photos that show a white guy shooting black zombies, this is a problem. A lot of times the solution there is we'll just take it out, we'll make it a black guy, so it's black people shooting black people, it's white people shooting white people. We will just remove the bandito, we will remove these other people, which creates sort of unintentionally a world that is all white, and in this other game, a world that is all black people, which itself becomes a source of controversy. Particularly groups want more representation of minorities, of gay or transgender characters, etc. So when we are attempting to walk that fence, reflexively removing those characters also could potentially cause offense. How do we walk that line when we're developing these things?
Oh, hell. Yeah, for me,
Good answer. That's
I know that a lot of, I think everybody went through boot camp, went through improvisation training. It's about being in the moment, and it's about listening, right? And that's the best answer I have. It's just being right where you are at the time.
And the only other thing I'll say to that is I always tell developers that they need to be logically consistent. Is there a reason why they are black or white or whatever? If you can defend your creative decision, I don't care what you do. But you should be able to, in your own world's logic, why is the protagonist white? Is there a reason for it? Now, sometimes there isn't, but ideally you've got some kind of thinking behind why you made that choice.
Yeah, I also want to, just one thing that somebody mentioned about Resident Evil was it was developed 98% by Japanese folks. They don't have the history of black and white relations in Japan not being a place rife with either black or white people. So I think there is a certain, we actually use, and we've been using this phrase here, the world is different now, but I don't know that the world actually is different. America is different. I don't know if that's true for the world. So I think you're right. You do run the risk of creating these fake worlds where there is nobody that nobody would recognize themselves. They never see the character because it's just not worth the risk. And I do think that that's unfortunate both from a sociological perspective and from an artistic perspective. Resident Evil, you kind of go around the world to different places. I think Resident Evil 4 was in Spain, Raccoon City is Canada or the United States, something like that. And you lose that if that's part of the story of the franchise. You lose that if you have to be so sensitive about making sure that only people of the same skin color do that. And so that does concern me. I think it's a worthy thing to worry about, having to worry about.
Well, I think maybe for clarification, the way I would look at it, it's maybe not the world. The world is different to a degree, but also it's mainly that the audience is different.
Yeah.
I mean, especially when you look at statistics for localization. I mean, localized version of content for games makes up about 50% of the industry's revenue worldwide. It's huge. And we're seeing, double-digit growth in emerging markets like Kenya, Nigeria. They're seeing 15 to 20% growth year over year. Mainly that's in mobile content, but nonetheless, these markets are growing very quickly. You're not seeing that kind of growth in North America and Western Europe. It's just not there. I mean, Russia's going to be the 8th largest market for games within a couple of years from now. And so that's where the audience is changing. So that's where a lot of this additional thinking, I think, needs to come into play. It's like the typical gamer demographic is just not the same anymore.
Thanks. So I'm wondering, kind of maybe from a more practical point of view, how you go about making sure that it is, I guess, appropriately sensitive, and also kind of knowing where to draw the line. Like, I'm sure if you dug enough, you could get a lot of different points of view. Like, you could find someone who would be offended by kind of, anything. So it's like, how do you find out, like, what is kind of potentially an issue in your game, and then how do you decide where to draw the line on what you're willing and not willing to do?
I can talk about that a little. I mean, it's hard. I think part of what helps is if you have a diverse team developing, then you can begin from a slightly more, grounded sort of sensibility. But even then, it gets a little tricky. I just went through one. We are creating a game that is designed. This was in response to a National Institute of Health request. They were looking for projects that would encourage minority students to consider careers in health. And so we're creating a game that's set in an urban emergency room, which has a very diverse staff. And the art style is a slightly cartoonish. I mean, just slightly. It's not there. Everybody's human, but it's kind of, slants a little kind of anime-ish kind of thing. But it was important that the heritage of the characters, be clear. That you could tell that, yup, that's an African guy, and that's a Japanese girl, and all that. You need to be able to tell that. And there were these really kind of uncomfortable moments because the characters are slightly cartoonish. So now, we have this sort of Japanese girl, and we're trying to make it slightly cartoonish because we want the game to be kind of light and fun. But is this now like a racial caricature? And it's a hard line to draw. And the only way you can do it is you talk with a lot of people and try and figure out, well, if anyone would be offended, who would be offended? And let's do some guest testing and figure out how they would feel about it, because it's tough.
I would also add, I could talk a lot about this, but I won't because there's not enough time. But 5 big issues: history, faith, geopolitics, anything related to inclusion versus exclusion. That usually involves gender, race, nationality, culture. If there's anything in your game that has something that identifies a particular character to any one of those specific things, that notion of being included or excluded, especially the exclusion factor, like, why do you have all these races but not mine, kind of thing. Why do you have all these countries but not mine? Why does everyone look normal except the guy from Ireland's wearing a leprechaun costume? Why? That kind of stuff. And then the other one is kind of a broader category of what I call intercultural dissonance, where it's kind of like the Age of Empires example, where Korea and Japan don't really get along historically, and that may play into, if your game is, say, we're going to release in Japan, and it happens to have content that's really offensive to Korea, or vice versa, that can get into problems. Those are 5 big issues right there, but a lot of things, like Jesse said, just being cognizant of what you're creating and ask people. I do that all the time, even in my job now. It's like I'll ask people in different markets if I need to, hey, what do you think of this? And a lot of times what you're looking for, you don't necessarily have to go and find like a sociological expert in a certain country, which you do that sometimes, but for the most part, you're looking for the knee-jerk reaction. You're looking for what would the consumer, how would they, a quote, normal consumer react to this? And so just, I've even done like an anonymous account and did like Yahoo Answers. And of course you have a huge problem with signal to noise ratio right there. But sometimes you'll get like even 1 or 2 or 5 answers from people who are giving you an honest answer saying, I wouldn't like that because blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, so maybe I should take another look at this and just kind of, re-examine what I'm doing.
If people are looking to be offended, they're going to find something offensive in there. And so, yeah, there's that sort of enterprise of line drawing. But whenever you are engaging in, any kind of real, trying to design a realistic game, I mean, if it's not a pure fantasy world, you're actually engaging in something that's getting some people in trouble on campuses right now, and that's cultural appropriation. If you heard about like dressing up as Halloween costumes, you guys are literally appropriating cultures to put them in these games. You're dressing people that way. You're depicting them. You're changing their behavior. So, for instance, I'm not even sure that you can have a video game world in a strict regime where you try to avoid cultural appropriation. It's one of those things that we hear to avoid that some people get sensitive about now. So I don't really think there is a solution there. So there are some places where you're just going to have to, I guess like Bethesda did with the Bronze, say, look, that's just how the game is, and if you can't handle it, you can't handle it. Because otherwise, I don't think we can reflect reality.
That's it, and that's that Brahma Bull, for example. That's very far down the line. But I think Kate said something very, very important, and it goes back to that story I told you about the junior designer saying your game is sexist. That was the moment where I became awake, where I woke up, and now I can't go back to sleep, and neither can the rest of our team, neither can the rest of our entire studio. We are no longer asleep. And, well, welcome to Crunch. We are no longer asleep, period. But, and that's a great thing. And so once your eyes are open, they can't be unopened. And it's a great moment sort of in game development for us. And we need to, as a group of creatives, embrace that and be happy about that. Evolution is, social evolution is an extremely positive and extremely challenging thing. But we're in it. And we're leading it. You guys are leading it in a big way next. What happens next, I have no idea, but I look forward to what you do.
Just one last thing on this point I wanted to mention. One thing I really recommend is you got to be really clear where you're willing to draw your line. What is your creative compass or whatever you want to call it, but you need to have one. And you need to think through what that would be. What would be the issue? Even run scenarios, like what would be the thing that you just say, no, I'm not changing this, forget it. I tried for all the years I was at Microsoft to get Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, to tell me what the line was for Microsoft, but they were unwilling to ever specify exactly what that was because they didn't really know. But it's like, even when I consulted with Google on helping them create their geopolitical team and worked on Google Earth and maps, where do we draw the line, so to speak, on the maps, on what we will and won't change? And even then, it was difficult to get a straight answer. When I first started consulting with them, it's like, well, we don't do things that are evil. So then I actually asked them in an email thread, where's the corporate definition of evil? Because I'd like to know. And of course, then I got all, people.
It's drone strikes, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I would just recommend you need to be kind of clear on, you do need to be clear, and it may happen over time. It's not always easy to just say, well, this is my line. You may have to shift it depending on what happens. But it's important to have it at some point.
I think we have time for 2 or 3 more.
So speaking of sensitive game contents, one of the things I can retell is Call of Duty 4. There's a level you literally go into an airport and shoot people down. So I really want to know how American people think of that. Is it too much or people think it's fine? That's my question.
I actually worked on that. So
blame her.
I'm at it.
So I think that's a really good example of staying true to the creative vision. Now, people can argue, was it proper to have a scene like that? But to their credit, they warned you like twice, I think, before you start that level. They warn you twice. Whatever the language was, this contains sensitive, may be sensitive, whatever it said, I forget. But basically, you had 2 warnings to either opt in or opt out or just kind of skip the level and move on. I thought that was a nice way to handle it. They warned you up front. They gave you another chance. You said, no, I want to do this, and you go in and you do it. And yeah, it's a sensitive level, but at the same time, I think it kind of underscores, I don't know, kind of the point, part of the point of the narrative.
I mean, I know I was thrilled when they did that because, you know, we have shooting games are so normal now, right? That it's practically a form of propaganda and a form of brainwashing, right? And the fact that Call of Duty was going to step in and say, no, we're going to remind you what shooting people actually means, right? And people felt it. It was quite controversial for that reason because it wasn't and what made people uncomfortable about it, it wasn't that, oh, I'm shooting people. Well, you've been shooting people the whole time. You're playing Call of Duty. What do you think?
Right.
You're actually, it's making you think about what it means to shoot people. And so I don't know. It was shocking to see what was fundamentally an artistic statement in such a mass market game. It was a little bit of an exciting moment.
One thing I think is neat about the opportunity that folks have with interactive entertainment like video games is that with regard to the warnings, you know, one of the real motivations for censorship, one of the motivations for you know, telling people that certain ideas aren't to be expressed is that they say, well, they can't avoid those ideas. But video games actually have the opportunity, and you know, through the ESRB system and through other things like that, where you don't have to be exposed to video games that you don't want to. So I think that kicks the sort of the leg out of at least part of the stool of demanding censorship of video games, that you're not exposed to those unwillingly. You can change those things in a much more granular way. If you think of other forms of art, you know, thinking of you know, a couple of very famous pieces of art, but I think one that brings me to mind is it was a piece of art where you had to step on the American flag in order to get to the piece of artwork, and that was part of the artwork. You know, and it was in a museum, and of course you'll see other avant-garde things. You actually have a lot more control on your Xbox than you do in a museum over what you're going to see. So I think that for people who are arguing, you know, oh, this game should need to be on the shelf or this is wrong, you know, I think a decent response is you don't have to, you know, sort of uniquely, like you're not going to run into this. I mean, unless wherever it's like Blade Runner and there's video games around us everywhere. You know, or Minority Report maybe, where they had the interactive ones. You know, you're not going to be put in that position.
Yeah, well, and I mean, the deep questions that you start to get into, it's one thing, I'm going to choose this or I'm going to choose that, but it's a whole other thing to understand sort of the larger cultural impact. Like one of the sort of surprising studies that's been done shows that children who play with, I don't know the right word, I guess sexualized toys, and by that I mean hyper pink toys, you know, Barbie dolls versus, you know, really aggressive boy toys, you know, extreme girl toys, extreme boy toys. Children who grow up playing with those are less likely to play with children of the other gender. Now, that's certainly probably not the intention of the parents who buy those toys or the children who find them interesting and appealing, but it is true, and it affects society, and the people who make these things are having an effect on society, and so that's where the conversation gets complex.
I love the raffle. Okay, cool. Jesse, you mentioned kind of the self-policing that can occur in students creating their work, and how there's not really necessarily any current appearance of institutions cracking down on that sort of thing. My question is also kind of tied to what Mitch mentioned about the revelation, if I can call it that you had when that junior designer talked to you.
The awakening.
The awakening, as it will heretofore be called. Yeah. So for students looking to get into the game industry, we're being encouraged to do these very purely artistic endeavors, right, and experiment. How concerned should we be with then finding jobs if we have portfolios full of controversial pieces, and we want to start working for companies where they have very kind of strict views on that, or they have very particular things, or something we did goes in a different direction than what they kind of want in their...
Oh, please may I take this one?
Yeah.
This is great. We were just talking about this with Drew on our tour of the campus. And when I hire people, I'm looking for only two things. One is talent. I didn't say experience, I said talent. And the other one is character, right? But Kate rightfully said it's about fit. It's about team fit, right? So if you're showing me your work and I'm offended by your work, do you really want to work for me? That's the point. So do you really want a job in a place where you can't be yourself? I'm not certain. Now, that's a very altruistic way of putting it, but we're going to work, and unfortunately for the game industry, over 40 hours a week together. And you have to live with me. And you have to live with your teammates.
No, I agree with that. And it's not so much when it's like a very specific and kind of successful point that's been made by a piece of work, where it's like I showed some value that I hold very dear and expressed it correctly and you received it in that same way, right? I wouldn't want to work in a place where my values weren't being tailored to in some way or another. But the question is, like, if I do something that is experimental, even for my own kind of sensibilities, right? And I know it's going to offend people of general sensibilities, and I like design it intentionally to do that in a way that is confrontational and maybe makes them think about something or reconsider or have some sort of change, right? Have a change in that player. I'm not there to explain that when someone's looking at my resume, and they're not there to have this conversation around, oh, I wouldn't do that if I were trying to sell this, right? And I don't need to do this in order to feel creatively fulfilled, but this is something that I was interested in, or this is something that I tried. Or more so, like, if I failed and that failure turned out to be offensive, right?
Yeah,
I mean, I guess I wouldn't have it in my portfolio, but whatever.
This is a simple question of what you choose to put in your portfolio, right? If you want to work someplace that's very safe, and you really want to work there, and you're sure they're going to be offended by this thing, then yeah, dummy, take it out of your portfolio, right? But I would say, in general, most people in the industry are excited when they see someone who's created something that really is sparking meaningful controversy, or something that took a certain amount of bravery, right? They might not agree with what they're looking at, but they're like, man, that was brave. We want that kind of bravery. And usually what happens is they'll hire you in, and then they try and change you. They like the idea of it much more than they like the practice of it. But I would say it's hard for me to imagine, unless you're just really got your mindset on working at like the safest studio possible, that it's going to cause you any trouble.
Yes, do you think it's different from the film industry? I mean, a lot of people come out of film school with very sort of avant-garde stuff, and I don't know, I'm a lawyer, so you would not want to see my art in any way, shape, or form. But I wonder how that works in film school. I suspect it's something like you were saying. Yeah, you might be impressed with that guy, and then you try to make him make Transformers or Revenge of the Fallen.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I don't think in most cases it's much of a real concern. I think the more you have brave, bold, exciting things in there, the more likely you are to get attention, and the more you're putting things in there that are of your true self, the more likely you are to find your tribe, because that's so much of what you want to do.
One last thing. I see a lot of portfolios, and I've been a hiring manager like most of my adult life, and there's a lot of bland crap out there, pal. So stand out, go ahead.
And one, I just cannot help but underline Mitch's story. Like Mitch's story of his awakening, where did the awakening come from? It came from a young junior designer kind of saying enough, right? And it's very easy when you're new and you're young and you're at a place and you're like, well, I can't have any control over this. And there's a perfect example of how you can. And there are certain issues where your voice, being younger, being more in touch with certain sensibilities, is going to carry much more weight than people who are much more senior to you. So please remember Mitch's story, because it's an important story.
only want to work with people like that. I only want to work with people that will speak up and lead in whatever area. You could be a junior designer, and you are the lead junior designer on your game, and you're the lead for speaking up for yourself, and I only want to work with people like you. And if you work at a place where you do speak up, and you are not only unheard, but there's some sort of retribution, well, great, you haven't found your tribe, as Jesse said, move the hell on.
I think we have time for one more. Oh, now everyone's hands go up.
Okay, so the topic of diversity within teams came up briefly. As of today, there are still only a handful of countries which take developing games seriously and at least meet a certain minimum threshold. So do you guys think it is important for more countries to be getting on this bandwagon, and should we be incentivizing this process in some way?
Well, yeah. Short answer. Actually, a lot of countries are awakening very, very quickly to the power of games, to the importance of the game industry within their country. I can give all kinds of examples. In my role as executive director, I go all over the world. I speak with government officials all over the place. I mean, I was in Bogota a couple of years ago. I spoke with the Minister of IT for Colombia, and he told me, this is the way he put it. He said, I see games as essentially one of the cornerstones of our country's future. And so I had to ask why, and so his vision was that games are a particular area of media that require engineering, technology, art, all these other fields, the humanities, all feed into the game technology or the game development. And he said if we can create a strong industry, then we can justify a strong educational system to feed the industry, and that education system feeds all our other industries in the country. Of course, my response to him is, I don't know what water you drink here, but I wish you would ship it to Washington, D.C. But I've heard this more and more. I was in Beirut back in April, and again, spoke to the Minister of Telecommunications. He gave an amazing, rousing speech about the power of games and how they see games as being this just huge economic force that's going to take place in their country. You know, and I mean, you're talking about a country, Lebanon, that has been through decades, centuries of conflict. I mean, you know, ISIS is just 60 miles away in Damascus and in Syria, and yet they're very optimistic, and they see games as one of the ways out of it. We had an IGDH chapter get restarted in Egypt during the Egyptian Revolution, and they contacted us, and I'm like, aren't you guys kind of concerned? It's like, yeah, we're a few blocks from Tahrir Square, but we want to make games because we're going to stay focused on what we believe is important. And so I think we're seeing a huge surge in emerging markets. We're seeing a huge surge in developed countries where they're starting to get it. It's maybe not happening as quickly as we want it to. Some of that is political barriers, but the upside there is that within about 15 to 20 years, every single politician on earth will have grown up with video games. So I don't think the political barriers will really be here anymore, but we just kind of have to weather that.
And I think one thing that's happening is the mobile revolution, the downloadable revolution, has completely changed where games can come from. You look at like top games, you're like, look, Angry Birds and Clash of Clans are both from Finland. Finland? Like, but nope, there it is. I mean, Clash of Clans is like #1 game in China from Finland, right? And these games really can come from anywhere, and I think we're going to see more and more as it's accessible to be able to create the games, as the games are getting out there, that it's just necessarily going to become just an international, worldwide creative phenomenon.
One other thing I think will be a good thing for us culturally is, as the world does get smaller or as the access, gets different, I think we will start to see more and different kinds of video games. Some of them may be shocking to us. Some of them may be offensive to us. Russians don't necessarily have the same sensibilities about stuff as the United States. I say understating the case. And yet, this is an enormous country of like 150 million people, a lot of very technologically, advanced, people with a lot of knowledge there. Could be some really shocking stuff coming out of there. We may not enjoy all of that. But at the same time, I think it's important to know that it's out there and to know the different cultures that are out there in the world. I think it'll be a really interesting thing. I think different places will come up with a lot of new innovations, and we may not appreciate them all here in the United States, but I think it's important that we know that they're out there.
Yeah, nothing personal, China, but knowing my character's blood type, creepy, right? That's culturally, from my point of view, that's a weird thing to know about.
I think we're going to end it on that.
That's terrible.
You just killed the whole thing right at the end. So,
Boring.
again, round of applause for everybody on the panel. And thank you all for showing up, and let's go have pizza.